The Battle of Midway, full documentary. Part 1, Prelude to Midway. How Japan's perfect war plan began to crack. In June 1942, just 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched the most ambitious operation of its war in the Pacific. Its goal was deceptively simple: destroy the last surviving American aircraft carriers, capture the tiny atoll of Midway, and force the United States to the negotiating table. Japan believed it still held the initiative. Its carrier forces were undefeated. Its pilots were the most experienced in the world, and its admirals were convinced that America was still reeling from the disasters of early 1942. But what they could not know, was that the Americans were listening. Every transmission, every coded order, every operational message sent through the Japanese Navy's encrypted system, JN-25. By early June, the United States knew exactly where Japan would strike. And as the carriers of the Kido Butai sailed east across the Pacific, they were headed not toward an unsuspecting enemy, but into a trap. This is the story of how one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled sailed directly into destruction. This is the Battle of Midway. Chapter 1, Japan Ascendant. The first 6 months of the Pacific War were, for Japan, a lightning storm of victories. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with alarming speed. Hong Kong fell within weeks. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February. The Philippines collapsed shortly after. The Dutch East Indies were conquered, ensuring Japan's access to vital oil fields. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching more than 4,000 miles across the Pacific. Its combined fleet, particularly its carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, appeared unstoppable. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by the elite air groups of the Imperial Navy, had delivered crushing blows from Hawaii to Ceylon. Their pilots were the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Many had been flying and fighting since the late 1930s in China. To American planners, the situation seemed dire. Japan's expansion appeared to have no natural limits. Chapter 2, Cracks in the Armor. Yet even at the height of victory, Japan's war machine carried the seeds of its own defeat. Pilot losses were irreplaceable. Japan had a small elite cadre of pilotsmen with over 2,000 hours of experience. But their training pipeline was slow, rigid, and elite-focused. Every death mattered deeply. After the battles of the Coral Sea and earlier operations, losses began to accumulate. Japan could replace aircraft. It could not replace pilots. The Japanese Navy misunderstood American resilience. The Imperial Navy assumed the United States would fight like European nations, seek peace after heavy initial defeats. They were wrong. After Pearl Harbor, U.S. public opinion hardened into a single unwavering demand: total victory, no matter the cost. Japan's strategic goal was unclear. Was the aim to destroy American carriers? Was it to extend defensive perimeters? To secure resources? To force a negotiated peace? Even within the Japanese high command, these goals conflicted. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that only destroying the U.S. carrier fleet could end the war. He needed a decisive battle, and he needed it quickly. And so, he chose Midway. Chapter 3, Why Midway? From the Japanese perspective, Midway Atoll was the perfect bait. Strategically, Midway was the last American outpost standing between Hawaii and Japan's expanding defensive ring. From there, American aircraft could threaten Japanese bases in the Aleutians and the Central Pacific. Operationally, capturing Midway would pull U.S. carriers into a decisive ambush, extend Japan's perimeter, place a Japanese base within striking distance of Hawaii. Psychologically, Japan believed that after Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, American morale was fragile. A defeat at Midway, so close to Hawaii, might break it. But most importantly, Yamamoto believed that the Americans had no idea where or when the next blow was coming. He believed his cryptographic system, JN-25, was unbreakable. He believed wrong. Chapter 4. Enter. U.S. Navy Intelligence. Deep inside a nondescript building at Pearl Harbor Station Hypo, a team of American cryptanalysts was fighting a very different battle. Their commander, Joseph Rochefort, a quiet, unconventional genius. While the Japanese Navy constantly updated and expanded its code system, Rochefort's analysts worked day and night to break JN-25. Progress was slow, agonizing, and often theoretical. But by May 1942, fragments began to connect. The analysts kept seeing references to a target called AF. The Japanese were preparing a major operation involving carriers, battleships, transports, and invasion forces. But what was AF? Some believed it was Hawaii. Others thought it might be the Philippines. Rochefort had a different theory, the famous water message. To test the hypothesis, Hypo arranged for Midway to broadcast a plain language message. Midway is short of fresh water. The Japanese intercepted it. Hours later, JN-25 messages referenced, AF is short of water. The mystery was solved. AF was Midway. With this confirmation, the Americans now knew the time of the attack, the composition of the Japanese fleet, the direction of approach, the intended ambush. The hunted had become the hunters. Chapter 5. Nimitz sets the trap. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood the strategic implications immediately. The Japanese believed the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet would be absent or destroyed. The U.S. Navy was still recovering. Surprise was on their side, but with intelligence in hand, Nimitz could turn those assumptions upside down. He concentrated his carriers northeast of Midway, placing them exactly where the Japanese did not expect American forces to be. He rushed the damaged carrier Yorktown into emergency repair. After being crippled at Coral Sea, Yorktown was expected to need months of dockyard time. It was repaired barely in 72 hours, and he prepared Midway Atoll for a siege. Marine fighters, bombers, B-17s, PBY Catalinas, every aircraft that could fly was dispersed, hidden, or fueled for combat. When the Japanese fleet began its final approach, Nimitz had already completed his battle plan. He would not wait for Japan to find him. He would strike first. Part 2. The Japanese Armada Advances. The Night Before Disaster. Chapter 6. The Japanese Armada Sets Sail. In late May 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched the largest and most complex operation of its entire war. Operation MI, the Assault on Midway. It involved 4 first-line carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 light carriers in supporting operations, 11 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarine pickets, a full invasion convoy carrying troops and equipment, an Aleutian diversion attack on Alaska. To the Japanese High Command, this was the decisive battle they had been hoping for since Pearl Harbor. The combined power of the Kido Butai had never been defeated in open ocean combat. Its pilots, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, had unmatched experience. Japan's confidence was absolute. But that confidence masked deeper structural problems. The operation was built on a rigid timetable. The force was spread across thousands of miles. The Aleutian diversion weakened concentration. Communication between task groups was slow. Yamamoto, the fleet commander, sailed far behind the main carriers, too distant to influence the battle when needed. On paper, it was a crushing hammer. In reality, it was a house of cards. Chapter 7. A Dangerous Overconfidence. Success had made the Japanese command complacent. Reconnaissance was inadequate. Despite knowing the U.S. carriers had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese assigned only a handful of long-range seaplanes to scout the most critical area, the northeast approach to Midway. One of those planes, scheduled to fly on June 4th, was delayed by mechanical issues. That single malfunction would have massive consequences. Submarines were deployed too late. Japan intended to place a line of submarines to detect American carriers approaching Midway, but due to delays, the line was not established in time. The U.S. carriers slipped through unobserved. The plan relied on surprise, and the Americans had already broken the code. There was no surprise left. Japanese doctrine was inflexible. To change ordnance, launch cycles, or mission plans required time-critical minutes that would determine life or death on June 4th. Japan sailed forward with absolute confidence, at the very moment when their enemy knew every detail of their operation. Chapter 8. The American carriers depart. While Japan's fleets spread across the Pacific, the United States prepared its trap. On May 28th, Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, stepping in for the ill Admiral Halsey. On May 30th, the still-damaged Yorktown, now patched enough to operate aircraft, joined them at sea under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Together, these three carriers formed Task Forces 16 and 17, the last hope of the Pacific Fleet. The transformation of Yorktown engineers had worked non-stop for 3 days to restore the ship. Smashed flight deck sections replaced, internal bulkheads reinforced, fuel tanks patched, elevators repaired. The ship still creaked with damage. Her air group was a mix of survivors from Coral Sea and fresh pilots with virtually no combat experience. Yet, Yorktown sailed. Her presence would prove decisive. Chapter 9, Nightfall. On June 3rd, the calm before the storm. On June 3rd, the ocean was vast, quiet, deceptively peaceful. American PBY flying boats made first contact. At 9:04 a.m., a patrol aircraft spotted elements of the Japanese invasion force. Hours later, B-17s launched from Midway, attempted high-altitude bombing runs, but with no success. The Japanese carriers, however, remained undiscovered. They steamed east, closing in on their target. The mood aboard Japanese ships, pilots cleaned their pistols, checked oxygen hoses, tightened goggle straps. Veteran squadron leaders reviewed attack formations with calm confidence. They had done this routine dozens of times. Pearl Harbor, Ceylon, the seas around Java. To them, Midway was simply the next victory. The mood aboard American ships? Very different. The U.S. Navy expected to lose ships, possibly all three carriers. Some officers quietly wrote last letters home. Pilots tried to sleep, knowing dawn would bring the largest battle of their lives. Enterprise pilot Lieutenant Dusty Kleiss would recall, "You could feel a tension in the air. Not fear, something else. The sense that history was about to turn." Key? This is Chapter 10, The Last Hours Before Battle. The Japanese flight decks awakened before sunrise on June 4th, 1942. At 4:30 a.m. aboard Akagi, flight crews began moving Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers into position. Admiral Nagumo's plan was straightforward. Launch a massive strike to neutralize Midway. Wait for reconnaissance planes to report any American ships. If carriers were found, switch ordnance and launch a second wave. Everything depended on timing. Then came the first mistake. One of the critical scout planes from the cruiser Tone, the one responsible for searching the sector where the U.S. carriers actually were launched 30 minutes late. A half-hour delay in war can be fatal, and in this battle, it was. Chapter 11. Japanese reconnaissance failure. The Japanese believed U.S. carriers were still at Pearl Harbor. Their scouting plan reflected this assumption. But the northeast sector, the exact direction where the American carriers waited, was poorly covered. Only 2 planes were assigned to this vast region. When Tone's No. 4 scout plane finally launched, it was already late. It would not detect the American carriers until the battle was already raging. This gap in reconnaissance meant Nagumo would make decisions based on outdated assumptions, that no American carriers were nearby. The trap was closing. So Chapter 12. Dawn approaches, two armies blind to each other. As the sun prepared to rise on June 4th, the stage was set. Japan believed a surprise was complete. Expected no American carriers, had already armed its aircraft for a strike on Midway Island, United States, knew exactly where Japan was. Waited patiently northeast of the atoll. Prepared to launch aircraft the moment the enemy strike group was discovered. Both fleets were ready. Both sides were determined. Only one side truly understood what was coming. Part 3. The morning of June 4th. The first strike's mistakes and the clash over Midway. The dawn of June 4th, 1942. The Pacific sky was still dark when the first silhouettes of warplanes began to rise over the horizon. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu launched their initial strike on Midway 108 aircraft in total. Bombers, dive bombers, and the deadly A6M-0 fighters. It was the moment the Imperial Navy believed would mark the beginning of the end for American presence in the Central Pacific. But what they didn't know was this. The Americans were already airborne, already watching, and already aware. They had broken the radio codes, tracked the Japanese approach, and prepared every available aircraft to resist the largest carrier strike force ever assembled. The Japanese first wave approaches. As the Japanese strike group neared Midway, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who couldn't fly due to illness but helped plan the attack, would have recognized the classic pattern: torpedo bombers at low level, dive bombers above, zeros weaving above them like a protective halo. But things quickly began to fall out of alignment. The American radar on Midway detected the incoming wave nearly 90 miles out. Air raid sirens shook the island. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners ran to their positions. The defenders were not surprised. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese attack would not fall upon an unprepared target. The defense of Midway, a desperate fight. At 6:20 a.m., the Japanese bombers began their assault on the island's airfields and positions. The Marines and Navy defenders threw everything they had into the sky. Buffalo fighters, Wildcats, and even obsolete Vindicators. The Japanese formation was tight, disciplined, and deadly. But the Americans launched aggressively, too aggressively. They charged head-on into the Japanese formation, often climbing directly into the path of the Zero escorts. The result was predictable and tragic. Many Marine fighters were shot down in minutes, others were heavily damaged and forced to crash land. Anti-aircraft guns became the island's primary line of defense. Still, the relentless American gunners shot down several attackers, throwing the Japanese formation into brief disorder. By the end of the attack, the Japanese believed they had inflicted severe damage. But they made a critical mistake. Midway's runways were still operational, and this would matter more than anything. The first major mistake of Admiral Nagumo. On the carriers far to the northwest, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received the report from his returning strike group. Another attack will be necessary. This message alone wasn't unusual, but combined with the earlier sighting of American ships misunderstood, incomplete, and poorly timed, it created the defining dilemma of the Battle of Midway. Nagumo had two options. 1. Launch his reserve strike force, already armed with torpedoes against the American ships immediately. Rearm them with bombs for a second attack on the island doctrine urged him to attack the enemy fleet first. But Nagumo hesitated. He chose to wait for more information, ordering his crews to rearm the planes with bombs. Moments later, a scout plane finally transmitted what Nagumo dreaded. Enemy ship sighted. Now everything needed to be undone. Bombs removed, torpedoes loaded, fuel lines connected again, and Japanese carrier decks became a deadly warehouse of explosives. American forces. Close in the first counterattacks. While Nagumo struggled with indecision, the Americans acted with clarity and urgency. Between 6 and 7 a.m., waves of American aircraft from Midway began their attacks on the Japanese fleet. None of these strikes were coordinated. Most were flown by pilots who were exhausted, undertrained, or flying outdated machines. But every one of them forced the Japanese carriers to launch Zeros, to intercept, maneuver violently, keep their flight decks unusable, delay rearming operations. This chaos would soon become decisive. The first attackers were Marine Corps dauntless dive bombers, followed by Midway-based torpedo planes, slow, underpowered, and hopelessly exposed. Japanese fighters shredded the formations. Entire squadrons were wiped out. But every attack delayed Nagumo's ability to launch his own strike. Every maneuver kept the decks cluttered. Every minute increased the danger of having armed aircraft packed in the hangars. The Torpedo Squadrons, acts of immortal courage. By mid-morning, 3 American torpedo squadrons were converging on the Japanese fleet: VT-8 from USS Hornet, VT-6 from USS Enterprise, VT-3 from USS Yorktown. Their aircraft, the TBD Devastator, was already obsolete in 1942, slow, poorly armored, carrying a torpedo with reliability issues, but they flew anyway. VT-8, the first to arrive. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, VT-8 charged straight toward the Japanese carriers without fighter escort. They flew low, slow, and unprotected. 0 fighters tore into them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air with shrapnel. One by one, the Devastators fell into the sea. Of the 15 aircraft, only 1 pilot survived. Ensign George Gay, wounded and floating in the water, forced to watch the rest of the battle unfold. Their sacrifice was unimaginable, but it would not be in vain. VT-6 and VT-3. The same fate. Minutes later, VT-6 arrived and met the same devastating resistance. VT-3 arrived shortly after, also paying a terrible price. Collectively, the 3 squadrons lost nearly every aircraft, inflicted 0 damage, forced the Japanese carriers into continuous evasive maneuvers, exhausted the 0 fighters, pulled the top cover of Zeros down to sea level. This last detail would become the pivot upon which the entire Pacific War turned. The stage is set for the turning point. By 10:20 a.m., the Japanese Combat Air Patrol was disorganized and low on fuel. The carriers were still loaded with armed aircraft. Deck crews were rushing to finish rearming operations. Nagumo's fleet was exposed just as the sky above them began to fill with the shadows of new aircraft. Not torpedo bombers, not marine fighters, but dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, arriving at the perfect moment. The sacrifices of the torpedo squadrons had bought the time needed for the decisive strike. The next minutes would change the history of the Pacific War forever. Part 4. The dive bombers arrive. The destruction of 3 carriers in 6 minutes. The Americans find the fleet. A miracle of timing. By late morning on June 4th, the American carriers had launched multiple strike groups. Navigation errors, scattered clouds, and the immensity of the Pacific meant that many of the dive bombers had been flying in circles, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet. They were low on fuel. They were split into small, improvised groups. Some formations were completely off course, but fate, instinct, and sheer persistence brought them to the perfect location at the perfect time. At 10:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, spotted something unusual far below. A lone Japanese destroyer, speeding north at maximum power. The ship was the destroyer Arashi. Moments before, it had been depth charging the submarine USS Nautilus and was now racing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey made a bold decision, one that no textbook could justify, but every great commander would understand. He followed the destroyer, and within minutes, the clouds parted to reveal the heart of the Kido Butai, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, sailing in formation, seemingly invincible. except now they were vulnerable. Critically vulnerable. Why the Japanese carriers were exposed. When McCluskey's dive bombers broke through the clouds, they saw something no American pilot ever expected to see. 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of fueled, armed aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangars. Fuel hoses ran across the decks. Crewmen rushed frantically to complete the rearming process ordered and then reversed by Nagumo. And above them, where the Zero fighters should have been, was nothing. The Zeros were all at sea level, exhausted from fighting off the torpedo bombers. The fatal gap above the carriers, the killing altitude, was wide open. The Americans had arrived at the exact moment of maximal Japanese vulnerability. The attack begins. Enterprise dive bombers. McCluskey split his force. One squadron would attack Kaga. The other would strike Akagi. The attack on Kaga. The first group, led by Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron, dove first, but confusion erupted. Instead of splitting their targets, nearly all of them aimed for Kaga. The sky filled with falling SBD Dauntless bombers, their dive brakes screaming, their cockpits vibrating from the wind pressure. Akagi was briefly left untouched, but Kaga was hit with devastating precision. One 1,000-pound bomb smashed into the forward elevator. Another detonated near the hangar full of fueled aircraft. A third plunged deeper into the ship's interior, igniting torpedoes and gasoline. The explosions tore through the carrier. Windows vaporized. Aircraft disintegrated. Fuel lines erupted into columns of flame. Within minutes, Kaga was a burning inferno. Her crew abandoned ship. Her fate was sealed. The attack on Akagi, Richard Best's critical dive. Only 3 aircraft were in position to attack Akagi. Richard Best, his wingman, and one more, Dauntless. Just 3 planes. But this would become the most important dive-bombing run of the entire Pacific War. As Best dove toward the flagship of Admiral Nagumo, the massive red and white carrier filled his view. He released his bomb with perfect aim. It struck near the mid-deck elevator, detonating among torpedoes that had been pulled out for rearming minutes earlier. A single bomb. One perfect hit. Fire engulfed the forward hangar. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Fuel tanks ruptured. Nagumo's flagship was doomed. And the Soryu, a separate disaster. While Akagi and Kaga burned, another American group had approached undetected from the east. Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Max Leslie, had finally located the Japanese fleet. They dove onto Soryu, hitting her with 3 direct 1,000-pound bomb strikes. One hit the forward section, igniting aircraft fuel. One tore through the midsection, detonating bombs. The third plunged deep into the hangar, destroying the remaining strike planes. Soryu was consumed by fire almost instantly. Her crew abandoned ship. Many jumped into the oily waters. Flames overtook the decks. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were now engulfed in towering columns of black smoke, all within 6 minutes. The shockwave, the Japanese Navy in chaos. In those 6 minutes, the greatest naval striking force the world had ever seen was effectively destroyed. Japanese officers were stunned into disbelief. Signals officers could not transmit coherent messages. Commanders were shouting contradictory orders. The Imperial Navy, confident in decades of training, doctrine, and tactical dominance, suddenly faced a reality no one had imagined. 3 of its 4 frontline carriers were gone, and the remaining carrier, Hiryu, was now alone against the full weight of American air power. Hiryu prepares to strike back. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, understood instantly what had to be done. He would not flee. He would not wait. He would strike back with everything he had. Within minutes, Hiryu launched her first counterstrike aimed directly at the American carriers. Wade McCluskey's dive bombers had landed the decisive blow. But the battle was not over, not even close. For now, Hiryu was coming for the USS Yorktown. Part 5. Hiryu strikes back. The sinking of Yorktown and the last stand of the Kido Butai Hiryu, the last operational carrier of the Kido Butai. By 10:30 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered the most devastating blow in its history. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning, crippled beyond hope. Only Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, remained operational. Yamaguchi was one of the most respected officers in the Japanese Navy. Calm, aggressive, and relentlessly focused in combat. He understood instantly that Japan's only chance to salvage the battle lay in striking back before the Americans could launch a second wave. He did not hesitate. He did not meet with staff. He did not wait for confirmation from Yamamoto. He acted. Within minutes, the flight deck of Hiryu was cleared. Her remaining strike aircraft were fueled, armed, and prepared. Yamaguchi's order was simple. Find the American carriers, sink them. The first counterstrike, Hiryu's dive-bombers launch. At 10:50 a.m., Hiryu launched her first wave, 18 Aichi D-3A VAL dive-bombers, escorted by fighters. Their commander, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, was instructed to attack the most valuable target, the American fleet carrier USS Yorktown. Thanks to visual reports from surviving Japanese scouts and a lucky break in the clouds, the VALs located Yorktown by early afternoon. The Japanese pilots were shocked. Despite being heavily engaged for hours, Yorktown appeared pristine, no smoke, no fires, perfect formation, and maintaining high speed. The Japanese assumed they were facing a fresh carrier. They had, in fact, rediscovered the same ship they had damaged at Coral Sea weeks earlier, and would soon strike again. Yorktown prepares for impact aboard Yorktown. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Captain Elliot Buckmaster detected incoming aircraft on radar. This time, the crew had precious minutes to prepare. Damage control teams were pre-positioned. Fire hoses were deployed. Anti-aircraft guns were manned. The ship increased speed to 30 knots, zigzagging to evade the attackers. Yorktown's AA gunners had already proven themselves that morning. They were seasoned, precise, and disciplined. And they were about to face Hiryu's best pilots. On the dive-bomber attack, precision and chaos. At 12:17 p.m., Hiryu's VALs began their attack run. They dove from great altitude, sun at their backs, pushing their airframes to the limit. Yorktown's gunners unleashed a wall of fire. The carrier's movement was so aggressive that several Japanese pilots overshot their target. But the Japanese attack was still brutally effective. 3 bombs scored direct hits. 1, a bomb pierced the flight deck near the midship elevator, exploding deep inside and igniting aviation fuel. 2, a second hit the port side, destroying compartments and rupturing fuel lines. 3, a near miss detonated beside the hull, damaging boilers and power systems. The ship went dark. Smoke billowed from the midsection. For a moment, Yorktown seemed finished, but the American crew was extraordinary. Within minutes, power was restored, boilers reignited, fire control resumed. The carrier began making headway again. By 1:20 p.m., Yorktown was steaming at 20 knots. To Japanese reconnaissance aircraft watching from afar, the sight was unbelievable. The same carrier they had just bombed was operating as if untouched. This misunderstanding would save the American fleet. The second Hiryu strike, the torpedo bombers. When Yamaguchi received word that the carrier they bombed was still afloat, he refused to believe it. But the reports repeated, "The enemy carrier is operational." Yamaguchi reacted instantly. He launched his second and final strike. 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by fighters. These were among Japan's most experienced torpedo pilots. Their orders were clear: finish the American carrier. At 2:40 p.m., radar aboard Yorktown detected new incoming aircraft. Still damaged, still struggling with earlier hits, the carrier prepared for its second battle of the afternoon. To the torpedo attack, Yorktown takes her final blows. The Kates approached low and fast, splitting into two groups to attack from port and starboard simultaneously. Yorktown executed radical evasive maneuvers, turning aggressively to comb the torpedo tracks. Her AA guns roared again, shooting down several attackers. But the Japanese torpedo pilots were relentless. Two torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side in quick succession. The first tore a massive hole near the boiler rooms. The second struck farther aft, destabilizing the ship. The carrier began to list sharply, first 20 degrees, then 26 degrees. Captain Buckmaster ordered, "Cease counter-flooding. Prepare to abandon ship." At 3:00 p.m., Yorktown's crew climbed down ropes and nets into rescue destroyers. They watched their ship, this survivor of Coral Sea, this fighter of Midway drift silently, wounded but not yet finished. Yorktown was down, but not sunk. Not yet. Hiryu's fate. The last Japanese carrier faces the storm. While Hiryu celebrated her successful strike, the Americans were preparing their counterattack. From Enterprise and the battered but still operational Hornet, dive bombers launched to finish the last Japanese carrier. At sunset, the SBDs located Hiryu. She was alone, surrounded by escorts, turning hard to evade. But it was too late. The dive bombers struck with precision. Multiple bombs smashed into the flight deck. Hangars erupted into fire. Aircraft exploded where they stood. Fuel lines burst, engulfing the carrier in flames. By the time the attack ended, Hiryu was mortally wounded. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. He chose to go down with Hiryu, standing beside his captain, as flames consumed the carrier that had been his pride. Before he died, he sent one last message. To all remaining forces, fight with all your strength. The fate of the Empire depends upon you. Yorktown's final hours, a battle between ship and sea. For 2 days, Yorktown refused to sink. Salvage crews returned to her. Lines were attached. Tugs attempted to keep her afloat. But on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, penetrated the destroyer screen and fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 sank the destroyer USS Hammond, which had been providing power and pumps. Yorktown slowly rolled to port. Her bow dipped beneath the waves. The ship that had survived Coral Sea and Midway finally surrendered to the ocean. At dawn on June 7th, she slipped below the surface. The Japanese Navy, defeated, disbelieving, broken by mid-June, Japanese admirals understood the magnitude of their defeat. 4 fleet carriers lost. Over 250 aircraft destroyed. Hundreds of skilled pilots gone forever. These pilots, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean, were irreplaceable. The Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was gone. And with it, Japan's ability to wage offensive war in the Pacific. Midway was not just a battle. It was a turning point written with fire on the ocean. A victory born of intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and timing, so precise that historians still debate whether it was fate or perfect strategy. Part 6. Aftermath and Strategic Impact. Why Midway Changed the War Forever. Silent Ocean, the day after the battle. By the evening of June 7, 1942, the waters around Midway were eerily quiet. Oil slicks spread across the surface in rainbow patches. Charred debris drifted aimlessly. Burned planks, shattered aircraft parts, broken rafts, and scorched life jackets. Floating among the wreckage were reminders of the greatest carrier battle ever fought. Fragments of both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy. The smoke had faded. The guns were silent. But the consequences of the battle were only beginning. The Japanese High Command, shock, denial, and fear. When initial reports reached Tokyo, the High Command refused to believe them. For years, the Kido Butai had been a symbol of Japan's unstoppable rise. Pearl Harbor smashed. The British battleship, Prince of Wales, sunk. The Indian Ocean Fleet nearly destroyed. American bases across the Pacific overrun. The carrier air groups were elite, highly trained, and practically undefeated. But the message from Combined Fleet Headquarters was unmistakable. 4 fleet carriers have been lost. Hundreds of pilots killed. The air groups annihilated. To Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the Combined Fleet, this was worse than defeat. It was strategic disaster. He is recorded as saying privately, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." The giant was now fully awake, and Midway had given him a weapon. So why the loss of pilots hurt Japan more than the loss of ships? The carriers could eventually be replaced. Pilots could not. Japan had entered the war with the best naval aviators in the world, men forged in years of combat in China, battle-hardened in dozens of dogfights. They were the ultimate professionals, precise, disciplined, deadly. And they were gone. Over 110 of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots died at Midway. The best Zero Aces, veteran dive-bomber leaders, elite torpedo bomber crews, squadron commanders with thousands of hours of combat experience. Japan had no pipeline to replace them. Training new pilots took 2 to 3 years. The Imperial Navy shortened that to 4 months. The results were predictable. Poor gunnery, weak formation flying, bad navigation, inability to recover from basic errors, catastrophic combat losses. Later at the Marianas Midway was not the end of Japanese naval aviation, but it was the beginning of the end. The American side, relief, resolve, and hard reality. In the United States, the reaction was very different. News of the victory electrified the country. After 6 months of defeat from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, Midway was the moment the nation needed. But for Admiral Nimitz, the victory was bittersweet. He had lost Yorktown, Haman, dozens of aircraft, many pilots and deck crew. The American carrier force was wounded but alive. More importantly, the industrial might of the United States was now fully mobilized. In 1942 alone, American shipyards were already working on 8 new Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 Independence-class light carriers, dozens of escort carriers. Japan had no answer for this. The strategic consequences. A permanent shift in power. Midway broke more than the Kido Butai. It shattered the Japanese Navy's ability to take the offensive anywhere in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan chooses where and when to fight. Japan expands across thousands of miles. After Midway, Japan is forced onto the defensive. It reacts to U.S. offensives. Its perimeter shrinks with every battle. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each campaign was made possible by Midway. Once the carriers were lost, Japan's grand strategy collapsed. No invasion of Hawaii, no threat to Australia, no renewed offensive against Midway, no realistic plan to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan would fight fiercely for 3 more years, but the strategic initiative had slipped away forever. And then why Midway? Happened the way it did, the 3 pillars of victory. Historians identify 3 core reasons the U.S. won Midway. Each was decisive. Together, they were overwhelming. Phone intelligence, the breaking of JN-25. Without Rochefort's cryptographers at Station Hypo, nothing else would have been possible. They predicted the target, Midway, the date, the direction of attack, the size of the force, the Japanese plans for the follow-up invasion. This allowed Nimitz to position his carriers north of Midway at the perfect ambush point. Japan walked straight into the trap. The timing, 6 minutes that changed the world. The sinking of 3 carriers by McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers happened because of a convergence of near-impossible events. Torpedo squadrons drawing the Zeros low, clouds concealing the dauntless dive paths, poor Japanese rearming procedures, Arashi leading McCluskey to the fleet, Zeros being out of position. bombs hitting hangars full of fueled aircraft. None of it was luck. It was the result of chaos met by American discipline and Japanese unpreparedness. American damage control and crew training. The fact that Yorktown absorbed bomb hits, repaired itself in minutes, survived torpedo hits, stayed afloat for days, is testament to the professionalism of the U.S. Navy. At Midway, the United States proved not only its courage, but its remarkable technical resilience. The voices from the survivors, final reflections. Many who fought at Midway later said the same thing. It didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a reckoning. Richard Best, who delivered the fatal hit on Akagi, later said, "We were trained well, we were lucky, and that day, the future of the war depended on us." Japanese pilot Saburo Sakai, who survived the war, wrote, "At Midway, we lost the air. And when you lose the air, you lose the sea." Admiral Nimitz summed it up more simply, "Midway was our turning point." Now, Midway's legacy, the battle that decided the Pacific. When historians look at World War II, they often highlight Stalingrad, El Alamein, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge. But in the Pacific, one battle stands above them all in strategic significance: Midway. It was the moment when the impossible became real. A smaller, wounded American force defeated the most powerful naval strike group ever assembled. A victory built on intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and a little bit of fate. From June 4th onward, the Pacific War was no longer about Japan expanding. It was about Japan surviving. And after Midway, even that was no longer certain.